Great. So first of all, welcome to the Mount of Olives. This is a very special spot. We usually do here a little kind of a thing, like a little ceremony that we're going to do in a minute, which I think is very exciting. But just I wanted to say a few words, and I think this is a good opportunity to wrap up some of the things that we've been talking about, okay? So remember how we mentioned every once in a while we talked about how many different kingdoms came and went here, you know, we talked about the connection to archaeology, so you had kingdoms kind of like the place kind of switching hands between a lot of different kingdoms. So to get kind of like a visual illustration of this, okay, this is as many kingdoms that have been kingdoms or rulers or whatever you want to call it, right, on this region, okay? It goes from bottom, it starts at the bottom, okay? We're not going to talk about all of them, but I want to focus, right? You see the Stone Age, of course, and all of this. Let's focus for a second on the Canaanite period, also known as the Bronze. In the middle of the Bronze Age, this is where we talk about the patriarchs, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? So this is kind of like the middle of this. From the year 1200 BC, this is what we describe, as you can see, they call it the Judges period. This is basically the time that the Israelites, the sons of Israel, are entering the land of Israel from the east, from the Jordan River, right, with Joshua. So this is it, this is the beginning of that. When we talk about the Israelite period, this would be, I would describe this as the beginning of King David, King Solomon, right, at the time that Israel is actually forming the kingdom. Now this is where it gets more complicated. In the year 586, the Babylonians are conquering the land and they destroy the first temple of the Jewish people, and then they're being actually replaced by the Persian. The Persian are replacing the Babylonians, and then they allow the Jewish people to build the second temple in Jerusalem. Right, so the second temple is being built and later renovated by King Herod, and this is what he built, right? The Temple Mount and everything that you see. This is the renovation of the second temple by King Herod. It continues to go with the Hellenistic period, which means the time that the Greek basically took over, right, with Alexander Mukdon. How do you say Alexander Mukdon in English? Alexander the Great, okay. Yeah. Alexander the Great. All right. Now, this is the Hasmonean period, right? The Maccabees, they kind of like took over, taking it from what remained from the Greek Empire. They took it from them, and they controlled for about, I would say they ruled the country for about 100 years, depending where you start the counting. But then you have the Roman period. The Roman period, this is when the Romans are coming, and we describe this period from the time that they arrived until the time that the empire with Constantine the Great kind of like transitioning the empire into Christian empire, right, or converting to Christianity. So from here, from the Roman period to the Byzantine period, more or less, this is where Waves Wall is at. Okay, Waves Wall is pretty much the beginning of the Roman period, right? And about, am I getting this right? Probably even just you say like 1st century BCE and 1st century AD, more or less. This is Waves Wall, right? The most pivotal times in the history of this land, you can say, because this is also, right, so the Roman period, and we're talking about King Herod the Great. In this period, we're talking about the destruction of the temple, the big Jewish revolt, the destruction of the temple, 70. We're talking about, of course, Jesus. So you have King Herod, Jesus, the destruction of the temple, also another big revolt that took place in the year 132, which kind of like ended the presence of Jewish people here because the Romans basically killed everybody or expelled everybody after the second revolt. So Waves Wall is really the pivotal time in this land. Then you have Byzantine. I'm going to run fast now, just a little bit faster. You have early Arab, you have the Crusaders, you have the Mamluk, okay, we didn't even really talk about them. You have the Ottomans are the one who built the walls of the city that you see today. You have the British, and then you have the State of Israel, right? Pretty short, right? This is kind of like simple.
Great, that's awesome.
Those are the things you need to memorize for 2 years in tour guiding school. And basically, you should know how to go from Abraham all the way to Bennett, you know, to the current Prime Minister of Israel. You go from Abraham to Bennett. All right. Now, the one thing I want to show you is just like, I have a nice illustration here of what Jerusalem would look like from your angle, more or less. well, it's your angle, but it's a little bit down. This is like the temple standing in Jerusalem of modern day Jerusalem, right? So this is like what you could see if you had come here. Let's say the temple was never destroyed. So I think it's kind of a nice illustration.
Yeah.
So you're looking down at the Temple Mount, and just to remind one more thing, that we've talked about it yesterday. At the southern part of the Temple Mount, this is where we stood. This is where we talked about the Fulda gates, right? The place where Jesus had to leave when he left the temple. He had to leave from the other kind of section that is now attached to the lower part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. If you cross the road from there, go down here, you won't see a lot. This is where the historical city of David is. You may have also pointed it out. So all of this part, everything that you're looking at, right from the old city and to us, to our direction, all of this is actually part of the West Bank. And we talked about it with the whole political situation over here. So all the kingdoms coming and going and switching hands and everything. When the British left, and the partition plan between that was supposed that what the UN suggested that will kind of separate Israel, the Jewish country or a Jewish state and an Arab state. This was all supposed to be in a, well, that's actually not accurate because Jerusalem was supposed to be international. But the result of the war of independence, or the war of existence, was that the Jordanian took over all of east of Jerusalem, including the old city, and everything from the old city west was taken over by Israel. So Israel made West Jerusalem its capital, but there was no way to get into East Jerusalem. That means no way into the old city, not the Western Wall, not the Temple Mount, anything, and not a way to go into Mount of Olives. But the other top of the Mount of Olives, if you remember looking from this direction, looking to the Mount of Olives, you saw it's like a double, it's like a camel a little bit, right? Yeah, so the second one had a university and a hospital that continued to remain as an enclave from 48 until 67, kind of like an enclave of Jewish presence, and they were actually convoys, you say, or convoys of military going up and down every once in a while trying to bring some supply, and they got hurt many times. You know, it was a very, very difficult time. And in 67, Israel took over the West Bank, which means including the old city and Mount of Olives, and the second hill here that is called Mount Scopus. That's the name. And in the year 1985, in the hospital in Mount Scopus, yours truly was born.
Oh, yay!
Yes. And do you remember we were in En-Gedi? We saw En-Gedi and we saw the old synagogue after we did Masada. This is where my parents lived actually, in the little kibbutz over there. So I lived there as well since the day I was born until I was 1. Okay, at the age of 1, we moved out more to the center of the country, but I still have maybe a little bit of En-Gedi in me, you know? All right, so this is why all of this together sums up to a very exciting point, and now I will change with Wave. Yes, Wave gave me that